Ray McGovern was responsible for the briefing of 6 different presidents, and then finally came to our last president and said, whoa, as did many of us. Is that what you said, Ray? Ray McGovern and Michael McPherson.
Good morning, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern.
Let's get right to it. I know your time is precious. We have some sort of good news this morning. Announcement from the Russians that they're really serious about negotiating a new strategic arms treaty. This follows the meetings between Secretary Clinton and Lavrov, the Soviet foreign minister, Russian foreign minister. And what he said was that, they really would like to have a treaty, a new treaty, before the current strategic arms treaty expires this year. But he's driving a hard bargain. He's talking not only warheads, he's talking delivery systems and so forth. So it's going to be tough bargaining.
Well, we have these plans to put ballistic missile bases in Czechoslovakia or the former Czechoslovakia.
Mm-hmm.
That seems like to me that might be good bargaining chips. What are your thoughts on that? Can you tell me?
Whether or not that's a good bargaining chip, Mr. President, that's a really good question. I'm of two minds on that. The symbolic value of our putting in ballistic missile defenses in Eastern Europe is a sign of relative weakness on the part of the Soviet Union, but it's only a symbol. What the Russians know is that what they know is this thing's not going to work, okay? And what they know is that this is part of the, the welfare program for the military-industrial complex. And so, they're just as soon let us bleed some more. There's billions already invested in that thing. But on balance, I think that they'd like to get rid of it. The question you raised, whether it would be a good bargaining chip, I don't think so. The Russians recognize it for what it is, but we'll be watching that very closely. I'd like to move now to a troubling prospect, and that is that it looks as though the hard right, the very, very conservative, for want of a better word, Benjamin Netanyahu is about to form a government in Israel.
Yeah, so there's a bit of trouble.
Now he, as you probably know, he's been pretty rabid about the threat, in quotes, from Iran. He's really talked about, or he's claimed that the Iranians are preparing a new Holocaust for Israel. I mean, that's the kind of words he uses, a la the 30s in Germany. So he's claiming that, if Iran got one nuclear weapon, whenever it is, next year or 5 years from now, that would be what he calls an existential threat to the existence of Israel.
Well, I was kind of asked this question that I'm going to ask you in my first news conference, and I tried to stir you, to be honest with you. How many nuclear weapons does Israel have?
Sir, they have about 250 to 300, deliverable by sea, air, underwater, and missile. So it's a kind of a stretch, and we look at this and we say, well, could it be possible that Netanyahu and many of the Israelis really feel this to be an existential threat? I suppose it's possible, especially given the history of Israel, or the Jewish people. But on balance, we don't think that the kind of threatening posture that Netanyahu and the others adopt is going to help things. That it's a very myopic policy, and that Israel is not going to be able to bomb, strafe, destroy the infrastructure of neighbors like Lebanon or even Gaza over the long run, and that those people really interested in Israel's well-being will recognize that and have to sort of lay a marker and tell Israel that this is not going to happen with our support. Now, a lot of people, cite the U.S.-Israel treaty, our alliance with Israel.
Yes, I was going to talk to our Secretary of State about that, because I'm not real clear exactly what that treaty is, what the provisions of it are, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mr. President, because this is a really key point. Your predecessor made a big point of saying that if anyone touched Israel, we were duty-bound to spring to its defense. That's not the case, Mr. President. There is no treaty. Israel is not our ally in the juridical sense of our having a mutual defense treaty, Israel and U.S.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Could you say that again, please?
Okay.
I'm not sure that I really understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
Please say that.
Well, this is the kind of thing you won't hear in Washington, and actually, I myself experienced some rather strong criticism for saying this before Congress back a couple of years ago. But it is the fact that there is no mutual defense treaty between the U.S. and Israel. And, Mr. President, you'd probably be interested in the reason why. Actually, our side, that is the United States, has on occasion proposed this idea to Israel with the thought that with that kind of security guarantee, the Israelis would not feel, so hell-bent on doing the kinds of things they do. Okay, well, the Israelis said, thank you, but no thanks. And the primary reason is that international treaties require clearly defined, internationally recognized borders. And for the last 41 and a half years, with the occupied territories since 1967, the Israelis don't want to get into that at all. Nor do they want, a partner that they would feel obliged to warn ahead of time when they decide to attack Lebanon or Gaza or whatever. So the Israelis really feel that they have a really neat thing going now because most Americans believe that there is such a mutual obligation. There really isn't. Now, we would, of course, say that if Israel were attacked preemptively or, without cause, we would certainly spring to its defense if it weren't something that the Israelis initiated themselves. So, bottom line here, Mr. President, is that Netanyahu, because of his appreciation, and he's very adroit, very astute, because of his appreciation of the body politic here, and the widespread understanding that we are, in fact, duty-bound to spring to Israeli defense, we are afraid that he will actually provoke deliberately an armed conflict with Iran, with the thought that if the Iranians were compelled to retaliate, the United States would be in there with 2 feet. And so we're worried about that. And, well, let me just say that Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of Joint Chiefs, he was sent over there to warn Israel about this last June. And he did something unprecedented for an American statesman in telling the Israelis, look, don't even think about it, okay? Don't even think about provoking a war or an incident in the Gulf, Don't think about the plan that Vice President Cheney had to paint a PT boat in Iranian colors and have it shoot at one of our ships. Don't think about that. And then what Mullen did that was unprecedented, he referred to the USS Liberty and he said, look, to the defense, his defense opposite numbers there in Tel Aviv, he said, look, we know about the USS Liberty, we remember it, there aren't going to be any more USS Liberties, do you understand? Whoa. Now that was guts,
Well, honestly, I'm not familiar with the USS Liberty. So I'm not sure why that took place.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. President. You wouldn't necessarily hear that in what we call the fawning corporate media, nor would you hear that very much from the people who are appointed to follow the Middle East. I'm thinking of Dennis Ross, for example, who would never think of mentioning that to you. In a word, there was a USS Navy ship monitoring all kinds of communications, not only Arab, but Russian communications in the Middle East in June 1967, during the war, and on June 8th, there was a reconnaissance of this ship in international waters by Israeli reconnaissance aircraft. A few hours later, fighter bombers came, did their best to sink the ship. After that, torpedo ships came, did almost sink the ship with one big torpedo. Bottom result, 34 U.S. sailors killed, 174 wounded, and I'm sorry to say that not only did President Johnson and his administration, but the U.S. Congress, and worst of all, the United States Navy covered that incident up, and the survivors of that incident have gotten no redress, and it's a sore point with me because it points up what can happen and what did happen in 1967 when the Israeli leaders were given the lesson that they could literally get away with murder, and we wouldn't do anything about it. So it's a problem, and I would recommend that you discuss this with Secretary Clinton and see if the kind of stern warning that Admiral Mullen gave the Israelis last June may be warranted once again, given the fact that Netanyahu is likely to form a government next week.
Thank you for this information. It seems I'll be talking to you more often.
Well, we hope every day. So now I'd like to just move on to a discussion of where we are with respect to Iran. As you know, we've invited Iran to participate in some multilateral talks, and Secretary Clinton.
I seem to get a message from my daughter.
Yes, okay, sure.
I don't know how to interrupt me. I apologize.
Were those dog barks I heard in the background there? What kind of dog was that? Mr. President, there's a lot of talk about the danger from Iran these days. Many people are assuming that Iran is, well, as your Secretary of Defense said, quote, hell-bent on acquiring a nuclear weapon, end quote. The intelligence community has a more subtle, or actually quite a different view. We used to assume that Iran was hell-bent on creating a nuclear weapon, but then we found out, and we looked very carefully at the whole information that we have, the whole body of it, that in the fall of 2003, Iran stopped working on the warhead design. In other words, on the specifically weapons-related part of their nuclear program. Now, the rest of the nuclear program goes along. They're doing the gaseous diffusion, the centrifuges. They're doing the missiles that could carry a nuclear weapon, but they stopped doing the warhead work at the end of 2003. And the last time we looked at it, they had not restarted it. So many of us in the vernacular would say, this is a hell of a way to be hell-bent on creating a nuclear weapon, We don't understand it. But, there's a way of understanding this, and that's why we're very hopeful that once you begin letting your diplomats and others talk to the Iranians directly, we can ask them. Some things are pretty simple. That can be done. But until then, please be aware that the intelligence community stands by its assessment that in 2003, Iran stopped creating a nuclear weapon part of this, that the other part of the development program continues, and that could be used, but it's a big if. It's very subjunctive. It doesn't appear that they've decided yet, and it appears that they're hedging their bets. They can always restart work, and we think we would learn about that very quickly. Of course, we'd tell you the next morning. But that's where it stands right now, so...
Well, it just seems to be a key piece of information that the administration and past one has been holding from the American people. Mm-hmm. So thank you for being honest with me.
I would make one suggestion, and we don't usually make suggestions, but when it pertains to our work, we feel free to do that, and that is that there's a very simple way to clarify where we at least are in terms of gauging where Iran is on their nuclear development program, and that is to commission a new estimate. The last one was November 2007. We wouldn't have to do a bottom-up reappraisal. It would just take us a month to look at the information between November 07 and now and be able to tell you and whoever else is interested what change, if any, should be brought into our judgment at that point that they had stopped working on the nuclear weapons-related part. Okay. Now, I'd like to move on to, unless you have further questions.
I have a question about Iran's nuclear power needs. Because they have stated over and over that they need to have this program in order to expand their nuclear power for domestic consumption. And I was wondering how valid that is.
Yeah.
And can it be verified?
Well, actually, that is verified, Mr. President. Back in 1976, when Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney were in the White House, they persuaded President Ford to allow Iran to buy precisely the kind of program that we're objecting to now. And they explained that by saying, not only will Westinghouse and GE make a bundle on this, Mr. President Ford, but also they need it. I mean, you know, the world's running out of oil. They can't depend on long-term provision of oil, so just like any other country, they're hedging their energy bets, and they need this. So reluctantly, your predecessor, President Ford, approved that deal, and it was started to be implemented when the Shah, of course, was removed from power, and now, of course, it's a different government there, and there's no question but that we would be supplying that kind of thing. Matter of fact, we're ranting against it, but be aware, please, that their energy needs were deemed to include that kind of nuclear energy capability at that time, and it goes in spades this time. So despite the new line from Cheney, who actually did say, you know, they've got all that oil and all that gas. What do they need? Don't tell me they need it for nuclear power. Well, that's quite a different song than he was singing when he was in the White House under President Ford.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, continue.
Well, I'd just like to bring you up to date on Afghanistan, because the realities there are going to require a lot of very tough decisions. We are aware that your bottom-up reappraisal of our policy there is not yet completed.
Excuse me, actually, I do have one.
Yes, please. Mm-hmm.
Or maybe two. I was reading some past estimates and other intelligence, and one of the things that I saw was that there's a possibility of Iran being able to get, in order to move their program faster, possibly towards nuclear weapons, get technology from some other countries, or possibly even a nuclear weapon. And I was wondering who would these countries be that would do such a thing?
Good question. Well, North Korea, of course, is in that business, but we are sort of saturating our coverage of North Korea where we have reasonable expectation we would find out right quick if the Iranians were still up to that. The Pakistanis used to do the same thing, but we pretty much riding herd on AQ Khan and the others. Besides that, Mr. President, we would know right quick whether this technology were available. The UN inspectors, and that's important, the inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency crawl all over that country. They are a signatory to the National Proliferation Treaty, which, of course, Israel is not. And so either they would find out about it or Iran would expel them, and we would know. That would be a sure sign that they've gone back on their adherence to that treaty. And so far, although there are ambiguities, although there are unanswered questions about what happened before 2003, Iran has fulfilled its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
All right, we'll continue about Afghanistan.
Yes. Afghanistan is going to require some real tough decisions, as you know better than I. Your baseline reassessment has not been completed, and I see lots of hope there because inertia seems to be a very great temptation. This is not really current intelligence, but I'm going to refer to something that happened 2,500 years ago, and that was Alexander the Great. And we have this thing about Alexander the Great. We've figured out finally why he was great.
Why was that? Tell me.
Well, he had this terrific army. I mean, he was an empire guy, and he wanted to get to China because he heard, China's a really neat place. Maybe he could subjugate China too. And he found out they had to go through this place called Afghanistan. See, and as soon as he got in there, all these, we call them militants today, a whole bunch of militants that didn't like foreign people coming into the country. Well, they started chipping away at his army. He was taking real hits to his rear. He looked around and he says, I may not make it to China. And he decided to change his mind, turned around, went back to Greece. Okay, that's why he was great. Okay, he could figure out, he could figure out what, and he did. And now, not everybody learns from history, and so you had the Persians, you had the Indians, you had the Mongolians, you had the British, and you had the Russians, all trying to prevail in Afghanistan. The Russians with 150,000 troops. So you might want to be aware of that. We run into disfavor in the intelligence community sometimes with the military because we too try to adopt that wider perspective, and to be very trite about it, the old adage, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, if you're a general, everything looks like a fight, and that's okay. I was an Army officer myself. That's what you do, okay? But the world is much more complicated than that. And so I hope that the various emissaries you've set out there will be able to kind of join with the folks here in Washington and adopt a policy that would move more toward negotiation rather than sending more people in there.
So it sounds like you're saying that the 17,000 troops and the others that I'm planning to send there really doesn't make much sense.
Mr. President, with all due respect, I think it makes sense only in the sense that the situation is so urgent in Afghanistan. The Taliban has become so strong that if we don't put 17,000 in right away, that there is some danger that we would have an ignominious withdrawal of the likes of Saigon back in '75. And so I see that as a stopgap measure, and I think your generals do as well. If we go beyond that, that would be a little bit different. And what I'm suggesting here is that since all of our allies believe that this is a quagmire or without much hope of resolution, that we ought to take a really tough look at whether still more troops are required, and whether we should do what President Karzai has suggested, and that is talk to the Taliban. This concept of we don't talk to bad people, it's really kind of weird. And
well, I agree with that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So that's the situation. The other thing is, the military realities is that you can't get there from here. I mean, the Khyber Pass bridge was blown, and now we're trying to figure out how to replace our base in Kyrgyzstan, which the Russians were clearly manipulating them to throw us out of there. And now people are saying we're going to have to depend on going across Russia. That's great. I'm an Army officer, and I wouldn't want my supply lines to have to depend on going across Russia. Or somebody said, well, maybe Iran. Yeah. Well, maybe eventually Iran. So
who those people are.
Yeah. So it's from a military standpoint, and I can speak from some experience on that. It's a real tough nut to crack. And
Afghanistan's tough. I've got my own ideas, and I'm going to continue to look at that. But this Israel-Palestine thing is really, really tough. Really tough. So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on what should happen? Just what are your thoughts?
Mm-hmm. we have to watch that, and it is our hope that we'll be involved in these discussions and be able to give you the best intelligence backup, the best intelligence information as to who it's possible to work with in the Middle East. Hamas, for example. Most people don't realize how Hamas was created. It was created by the Israeli service. It was created because Arafat and the PLO were considered to be, you know, a dangerous sort of non-sectarian, non-religious kind of thing. And so the Israelis thought, well, let's create this Islamic thing, and you know, and now look, you know, look what they have. Besides, of course, they won the election fair and square. Jimmy Carter was there. So these realities are looked on by the world and need to be cranked into all our calculations. And we look for a kind of a new day in the Middle East with George Mitchell and yourself in charge.
Well, thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking to you more on these issues. And I actually have to hurry because I have lunch with Michelle.
Aha.
It's not good to be late.
Thank you, Mr. President. Union, but it's only a symbol. What the Russians know is that, what they know is this thing's not going to work, okay? And what they know is that this is part of the, you know, the welfare program for the military-industrial complex. And so, you know, they're just as soon let us bleed some more. You know, there's billions already invested in that thing. But on balance, I think that they'd like to get rid of it. The question you raised, whether it would be a good bargaining chip, I don't think so. The Russians recognize it for what it is, but we'll be watching that very closely. I'd like to move now to a troubling prospect, and that is that it looks as though the hard right, the very, very conservative, for want of a better word, Benjamin Netanyahu is about to form a government in Israel.
Yeah, so there's a bit of trouble.
Now he, as you probably know, yeah, he's been pretty rabid about the threat, in quotes, from Iran. He's really talked about, or he's claimed that the Iranians are preparing a new Holocaust for Israel. I mean, that's the kind of words he uses, you know, a la the 30s in Germany. So, so he's claiming that, you know, if Iran got one nuclear weapon, whenever it is, next year or 5 years from now, that would be what he calls an existential. The current strategic arms treaty expires this year. But he's driving a hard bargain. He's talking not only warheads, he's talking delivery systems and so forth. So it's going to be tough bargaining.
Well, you know, we have these plans to put ballistic missile bases in Czechoslovakia, or the former Czechoslovakia.
Mm-hmm.
That seems like to me that might be good bargaining chips. What are your thoughts on that?
Whether or not that's a good bargaining chip, Mr. President, that's a really good question. I'm of two minds on that. The symbolic value of our putting in ballistic missile defenses in Eastern Europe is a sign of relative weakness on the part of the Soviet.
Ray McGovern was responsible for the briefing of 6 different presidents, and then finally came to our last president and said, whoa, as did many of us. Is that what you said, Ray? Ray McGovern and Michael McPherson.
Good morning, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern.
Let's get right to it. I know your time is precious. We have some sort of good news this morning. Announcement from the Russians that they're really serious about negotiating a new strategic arms treaty. This follows the meetings between Secretary Clinton and Lavrov, the Soviet foreign minister, Russian foreign minister. And what he said was that, they really would like to have a treaty, a new treaty, before potential threat to the existence of Israel.
Well, I was kind of asked this question that I'm going to ask you in my first news conference, and I tried to stir you, to be honest with you. How many nuclear weapons does Israel have?
Sir, they have about 250 to 300, deliverable by sea, air, underwater, and missile. So it's a kind of a stretch. And we look at this and we say, well, could it be possible that Netanyahu and many of the Israelis really feel this to be an existential threat? I suppose it's possible, especially given the history of Israel, or the Jewish people. But on balance, we don't think that